Party get into the position that they're in. And I go back to, as I said at the beginning, I go back to Wisconsin, 2011, 2012, the Democratic Party just not anywhere near willing to take up the fight in Wisconsin. In fact, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the head of the DNC, actually on TV said it's not a national issue, it's a Wisconsin issue. And you know, my head virtually exploded at that time, which is why I was glad to see her go in 2016, and it would be, in my view, good to see her go in 2018. And here to talk about his campaign, running to do just that, send Debbie Wasserman Schultz into the private sector, I've got Tim Canova. He's an independent candidate for the 23rd district there in Florida. Tim, thanks for taking time for us.
Thank you, Rick. It's wonderful to be with you.
So, you know, I go back to this moment, and, you know, 2011, we're sleeping on the marble floor in Wisconsin of the state capitol. Scott Walker's ramming through Act 10. They're beginning what is the entire No Rights at Work agenda. And yet, you know, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the DNC, President Obama, the entire Democratic establishment, it was silence. It was not just silence, it was complete silence.
You know, this Democratic Party and that leadership that Wasserman Schultz was part of, and that really is still in place, has not had their finger on the pulse of the American people for a long time. And I think what you mentioned with Wisconsin is a prime example of it. For them to think that this was something that was only confined to Wisconsin and was not a trend happening nationwide was, you know, it's a reflection of how tied they are to Wall Street and corporate agenda. These mainstream Democrats spend 30 hours a week dialing for dollars in call centers, and they start looking at the world through the eyes of the 1% and of Wall Street executives.
So what it means now is we need to reclaim these elected offices, put people in who aren't going to be beholden to Wall Street and to corporate dollars and PAC money and all of that. And that starts by, well, one, funding campaigns with small dollar donations, but two, and more importantly, in my view, getting involved in those campaigns and bringing people back to the process.
Yes. Well, we ran against Wasserman Schultz in 2016 in the Democratic primary, and we were very successful in raising money that year in small donations online. More than 200,000 times somebody in this country went to their computer and donated an average of $17 to our campaign at timcanova.com. And we used that money to build up a very big grassroots army. We had 4 field offices, we had hundreds of volunteers, and we came very close to unseating Wasserman Schultz. This time I'm running as an independent. It's more challenging to raise money just because folks aren't paying as much attention to the election cycle as they did in 2016 in a presidential election year. But in just the past 3 weeks since announcing I was running as an independent, we've seen a big upsurge in small donations online, again, at timcanova.com. And we like our chances very much. We're going to be on the ballot in November. It'll be a 3-way race, and the voters are going to have a real choice between a corporate-funded Democrat, Wasserman Schultz, a corporate-funded Republican, or our campaign, which is a very grassroots, people-centered campaign.
Why do you think you're seeing an uptick in donations right now?
Well, it's clear that people are just tired of the Democratic Party. It took me a long time to finally exit once and for all. I had been a lifelong Democrat from the time I registered at the age of 18. I had worked on Capitol Hill out of college for a Democrat, the late U.S. Senator Paul Tsongas, and it took a lot to drive me out of the party. My own circumstances are somewhat unique. It's a very Democratic district I'm in. We had our questions about the final count in the 2016 primary, and we tried to inspect the ballots. We were forced to sue just to enforce our inspection rights under Florida law. And while our lawsuit was pending, the Broward County Supervisor of Elections destroyed all of our paper ballots in violation of federal law, state law, the court's authority. And we tried to get the Democrats here in Broward County and statewide in Florida to at least call for an investigation. And the silence was deafening. And, you know, their silence was deafening at the same time that you take a look at this younger generation of millennials and younger, and they're anything but silent. They were very active last year in the Bernie Sanders campaign. They're active now in the wake of the Parkland shooting, school shooting here in Florida. They were active, the Gen Xers, the millennials and younger, They were even active as far back as Occupy Wall Street. So most of those folks are independent voters. When you take a look at the millennials and younger, 70% of them are non-party affiliation. So I thought, why stay in a closed Democratic primary where they seem to be fine with the destruction of paper ballots? It doesn't bother them in the slightest. I'd rather just run as an independent and be engaging all these other voters who have opted out of the system. You know, nationwide, the estimates now are between 40 and 45% of voters are now non-party affiliation, making no party the largest party in the country, ahead of Democrats and Republicans.
No, it kind of reminds you of that movie Brewster's Million. Vote none of the above. So let's talk about some of the issues that you're running on. I mean, because at the end of it, I like to believe that we vote for people on their positions. I like to believe that we vote for their vision for the country, and we just don't care if there's an R or a D behind their name, even though I do live in the real world and understand for a lot of people that does matter. What's your number one issue? What's that issue you die on?
Well, election integrity, political integrity has got to be the top issue these days. When we have so little faith and confidence that our ballots are even being counted, when corporate money is corrupting the system, people are losing faith. And I think the biggest issues now are not Democrat versus Republican or left versus right. It's corruption versus integrity. So our campaign stands for election integrity, which means we want 100% paper ballots counted by hand in public and reported at the local precinct level right away, the way it was for 200 years in this country. The electronic voting machines are a disaster. Anyone can hack into them. It's not just foreign powers that can hack into them. So we need real election integrity and political integrity. That means getting corporate money out of politics, overturning Citizens United. Aside from sort of those political process types of issues, which I do think are paramount, what would I do when elected? I've been for a Jobs for All program really my entire adult life. I think if we can have a full employment economy, bring jobs back to the United States in the private sector, but also to be creating a very strong public sector, the way the New Deal did during the 1930s and 1940s. The federal government should take the lead, even in subsidizing local school teacher salaries. We need better paid teachers, a lot more of them, smaller class sizes. That's more important than the federal government trying to set standards for nonstop testing of students. So I think jobs for all, Medicare for all, those types of progressive policies that I always say it's not progressive if it's not progress for all, if it's not helping everybody. Otherwise, it's just the same old trickle down.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And look, you see all these teachers across the country in the streets because pay is so pathetically low in a lot of these states, and it's the states who have really grabbed onto this tax cut fetish. And look, I know the federal government has it. There's an entire political party that's not even closeted anymore. Everything's about cutting taxes, and Democrats as well. They're another one who on the tax cut fetish a lot of times. How do we begin to push back on that and say, look, when we were under the tax code of a good socialist president like Dwight David Eisenhower, we invested in roads, we invested in bridges, we invested in education, we invested in the future of the country, and oh, by the way, weren't massively in debt year after year after year and running deficits as far as the eye can see.
A lot of these deficits we're running are what we would call passive deficits. When you've got so many millions of people who have fallen out of the labor force, discouraged workers who have stopped looking for jobs, or people who have very low-paying, stagnant jobs. They've got 3 or 4 part-time jobs, consulting jobs when they want full-time jobs, or they're driving for Uber. That's a lot of underemployed and unemployed resources that aren't paying taxes anymore. So the deficit is more a symptom of the problem rather than a cause of the problem. I think we have to make the argument, as you're saying, that you look at American history, whether it's Franklin Roosevelt or Dwight Eisenhower, that whole New Deal tradition when we built up the infrastructure of this country, and we had a national infrastructure bank. It was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Today, the United States is one of the few major countries of the world that doesn't even have a national infrastructure bank. So we don't even just have to talk about sort of fiscal policy and taxes. There's other ways to get about putting people back to work. Use the Federal Reserve for a quantitative easing program for Main Street, not just for Wall Street. The Fed should be making loans at near 0% interest rates for union pension funds and trust funds, the same way they did for hedge funds for a decade, basically, for these hedge funds. You know, if it had been the reverse and the Fed had made zero interest loans or near zero interest loans to union pension funds, but didn't give support for hedge funds, it'd be a much different kind of recovery we're in right now. The pension funds wouldn't be in any trouble, but Wall Street would be. So we need to reorient the Federal Reserve, monetary policy, public banking, all towards helping Main Street, and enough of coddling Wall Street already.
No, you're absolutely right. You know, Tim, that pension issue is, something that we hear an awful lot about. Here in Pennsylvania, they talk about, the state has a $44 trillion pension liability, or they throw some outrageous number out there, and it's not trillion, it's billion. But they throw it like there's this massive crisis, and we've got to privatize it. Instead of doing what you're saying is, look, make sure that the people at the bottom are whole. Make sure that people can retire with dignity and security, much like we've done to the banks. You are so spot on there.
Well, and this is the problem with the Democratic Party over the last generation, is that they do not make the case for the public sector anymore. They accept the entire, call it a neoliberal model. It's really austerity for the public sector. So we let our schools deteriorate, we let the infrastructure deteriorate, and what is the solution then for these neolibs and neocons? It's to privatize everything.
Yep.
Well, that system is not working. That model is breaking down. We have to remind voters that we have a constitution that gives the federal government definite powers to legislate for the general welfare, and it's not doing that. And I think that folks are ready for this message. Bernie Sanders would be in the White House if things hadn't been rigged last year. The majority of the American people are way out front, ahead of the elected class of politicians, because those politicians are really in the pockets of big corporations. They're not with the people anymore.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Let me ask you last line of questioning, because you brought the New Deal up a moment ago. And for me, we need another New Deal type labor policy. You brought up Uber. You look at the gig economy that's coming. Automation is coming, going to cause a raft of job loss. At some point, we've got to be talking about 21st century labor law reform, so that people who go to work, they play by the rules, they work hard, that they should be able to get ahead. And as things change, they shouldn't be left on the side of the road with a tin cup and pencils.
It's got to be easier for Americans to organize into labor unions. We need card check for organizing. I favor repealing as much of that Taft-Hartley law from 1947 as possible. Folks forget that when you have weak unions, you have a declining middle class. When you have weak unions, it means 94 cents of every new dollar that's earned by these corporations ends up in the hands of either wealthy shareholders or wealthy CEOs. This distribution of wealth and income is a reflection of a maldistribution of power. When the 1% has all the seats at the table and the American people and workers are not represented, whether it's on corporate boards or in government, you're going to just have this top-heavy trickle-down economy.
Yeah, as I say, if you don't have a seat at the table, chances are you're on the menu. And this is where things are, and you're so spot on. I wish you the best.
Thank you, Rick.
I hope you keep hammering away down there, and
you can count on us. This is the epicenter of the political revolution. If we can take down Wasserman Schultz and do it in an independent challenge, it's going to send some shockwaves through the system. So I urge your folks, go to timcanova.com and help us any way you can.
Good stuff, Tim. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Rick.
Good stuff, Tim Canova. Again, timcanova.com. Check that out. Love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Do we pursue another New Deal? As I've said for years now, I'd like to hear it. Rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break. Right back.